in London. We're directly under the Great Dome designed by Sir Christopher Wren. And this is, of course, primarily a place of worship, but it's also used as a place to debate the great issues of the day, often actually right here under the dome, or in centuries past, outside in the Cathedral precinct by St Paul's Cross. Anyway, welcome to Question Time. Good evening to you at home, good evening to our audience here in St Paul's, and of course to our panel, the Business Secretary, Vince Cable, the Shadow Health Minister, Diane Abbott, the former Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, the Mail on Sunday columnist, Peter Hitchens, and the Reverend Giles Fraser, back in St Paul's for the first time since he resigned his post here over the handling of the protesters in last year's Occupy camp. Good, thanks very much. And Matt Babington has our first question.
In light of the recent high-profile case, is it time for a fundamental overhaul in the way people are selected for jury service?
Yes, the Vicky Pryce case, of course, led to the jury being dismissed. Is it time for a fundamental overhaul of the way that people are selected? Diane Abbott.
No. I think that the principle that you're judged by a jury of your peers is a very important one. One of the things we have to remember about the case in question was that the point at issue was this notion of marital coercion, and I'd not heard of it as a kind of legal concept before now. And I'm not surprised in a way that the jury got a bit muddled. This clearly wasn't perhaps the best jury one's ever heard of. But if you speak to lawyers, and if you speak to judges, and if you speak to people in the legal profession, the principle of trial by jury is very important. It helps to give our legal system some legitimacy, because juries, by and large, are the only part of the criminal justice system which is actually a cross-section of the wider society.
OK. Peter Hitchens.
Yes, it does need an overhaul. That's partly because it was overhauled, and everybody's now forgotten this or doesn't know it, in the early 1970s, when the old property qualification was dropped. Now, people would say a property qualification is unjust. There was a lot of discussion at the time as to whether we should then have some kind of educational qualification, but they couldn't agree on one. So they just said everybody who was on the electoral roll should be on the jury. At that time, of course, the minimum age for voting was 21. It's now dropped to 18. I think that although many juries, and I think many people here will probably have served on them, are actually extremely serious and do their job very well, there is a number of juries which falls below the proper standard, which contain people who simply aren't capable of judging the facts before them properly. And I think it's time that we did have some sort of educational qualification and also some sort of minimum age. I think 18 is too young to decide the fate of another human being.
What was the property qualification, and why do you think that was better?
Well, I don't think it was better. I think it needed to be reformed. The problem with it was in those days that it ruled out, in England, it ruled out women almost entirely. In Scotland, they adjusted it so that it allowed women in, but it was basically, it meant you had to be middle class to be on a jury. And they decided this had to go, but in their egalitarian thrust, they could not think of any educational or other qualification to set in its place. So everybody gets on. And I think it's quite clear that not everybody, and if you were facing trial and your entire future, your liberty and your reputation depended on 12 people, you'd be very, very worried indeed by some of the juries which people have to face. There's another thing about this, which we forget, that back in the 1960s, Roy Jenkins got rid of unanimous juries. Now, many of you will have seen that great film, 12 Angry Men. The whole principle of the jury was it had to be unanimous, which meant that if somebody really, really was convinced that there was reasonable doubt about someone's guilt, they could hold out till the end, until the others agreed with them, or a new trial had to be held. That's gone now. Now it's just a matter of a little bit of time passing, and the judge can say, go away and have a majority verdict. These protections are very, very, very important for a free society. Otherwise, a trial is nothing but the state ganging up on you.
The woman there in the middle.
I'm a serving police officer. I've seen a number of juries and I've seen a number of different, almost types of juries in different courts. And it is quite apparent that there are some major failings in the system. I've seen jurors falling asleep and yet they're not challenged in the court. They're not woken up by anybody. And I think that there's some real concerns around things like that. I think it's a little difficult to suggest an educational standard as a minimum. But I do suggest that perhaps a failing on the part of the prosecution, a failing on the part of the defence, not to ensure that you are working to the lowest common denominator, that everybody on that jury, no matter whether they have a PhD or whether they actually never completed school, should make no difference. It should be given to them in the words in which they can comprehend what's in front of them.
But what do you do if you have a jury? It's rather weird for a juror to come to say, can we come to a verdict based on a reason that wasn't presented in court and has no facts or evidence to support it either from the prosecution or the defence? What was that all about? Giles Fraser.
Well, I don't think this will be the first time I think this evening, but I couldn't disagree more with you, Peter, about this business about having to be intelligent to be on a jury. We have a common law. It's law that's judged by the common people. We all judge each other. That's using common sense. And the idea that intelligence is some way of protecting us against some sort of irrationality in making these decisions is just not fair. I mean, David Hume was right when he said reason is a slave to the passions. And actually, reason isn't always what you want. You want people, us, ordinary people, judging each other. That's a basic principle. And if you have to be clever or posh or have a house, I think that fundamentally undermines a basic principle of justice, is that we, as the people of this country, judge each other in court.
Giles, could I just say, it's not intelligent. It's just very important, this. It's not some kind of IQ rating that I'm suggesting. It's experience and wisdom. You are deciding the fate of a fellow human being. You need experience. So it's not intelligence. Those are the things you need to find. Somehow or other, some qualification can be devised which finds them.
Man in the front here.
This is one high-profile case. Had it not been in the newspapers and in the media, we wouldn't know a thing about it. This is just another knee-jerk reaction that brought about by people like yourself, Peter. We'll do it because it's something to shout about. Very simple.
It's an important issue, it really is.
Michael Heseltine.
I think the point about the exceptional case is important, and I strongly would argue for the status quo. Peter helped me by giving examples of the sort of changes that he had in mind. He mentioned age. Well, we're perfectly prepared to send people out at the age of 18 to kill people in Britain's name all over the world where it's appropriate. And are you seriously telling me that they are too young to make a judgment about what is right or wrong? I don't believe that. And Peter's other point was they need to be educated. Well, who's going to decide who is and who is not educated, or what being educated amounts to? And the moment you start asking these questions, of course, you have to have someone to make the decision. Who makes the decision? People appointed by the party politicians? Some independent group of worthies who've got an intellectual approach to life? You tell me of somebody that you would accept as a reasonable alternative for one ludicrous decision by a jury to ask the question David asked: can we take into account evidence for which there is no fact, no evidence, nothing to base it on, and was never raised in this court? How can you begin to ask a question like that if you were sitting on a jury?
The man up there on the gangway, you, sir.
Yeah, I think as soon as you start making it about kind of someone's educational level or their age, then you make it a preserve of a certain strata of society, which I thought was kind of counterproductive to what the whole point was. OK. Vince Cable, of course, I suppose we don't, when the assumption isn't that all 12 jurors wanted to ask this question, but maybe 1 or 2 jurors did, isn't it? And then the rest of the jury thought, well, we can't explain it to you, we better get the judge to explain it to you.
Yeah, I don't think the point's already been made that this was a very odd case in a very unusual trial. And the point is, you are going to get people on juries who are not very bright, you'll get juries that are incompetent, but you get judges that are incompetent, you get prosecutors that are incompetent. That doesn't mean to change the whole system. And I think Giles was right. It is one of the very basic principles of criminal justice in the UK that you have a right to be tried by your peers through a jury. We tamper with it at our peril. In the past, politicians have tried to remove jury trials. A few years ago, it was suggested that the ordinary members of the public are not bright enough to deal with fraud trials. That was, you know, a backward move. I think the jury system is obviously going to have bad cases, but we should preserve the principles. It's a right one, and we should treasure it.
OK, I'll take one more point, then we'll move on. From the lady there.
Should we ensure that all jury members can actually speak English and understand English?
I don't think that was the issue with this particular jury.
But that was the question.
No,
I'm saying as the jury on the
This
whole.
was an exceptional jury, and you shouldn't make I don't think we should make extrapolations about juries. You know, a lady there said that she'd seen jurors falling asleep. I've heard of judges falling asleep. I've heard of barristers that could send you to sleep. I believe that the right to a jury trial by people that look like a cross-section of the wider community is absolutely crucial for people like my constituents continue to have confidence in the criminal justice.
But Diane, it must be right. The question was asked.
But you do have to speak English.
It must. You have to read the answer. It must be right that you have to speak English, or you can't begin to understand the trial.
But that's not an issue. You have to read.
It wasn't named as an issue in this particular case, but there will be cases. And there are cases where some jurors don't have English as their first language and may speak it, but may not fully understand the nuances of some of the stuff that is discussed.
Okay.
And someone in court might have an interpreter, but the jury members don't.
All right.
This is not just an individual case. If you're conscious of what's going on in our courts and pay attention and attend them to report on them, you will see that there is a problem with juries, which goes a lot wider than this case. One thing I might say to Michael Heseltine, the very reason why we send young men out as soldiers, often wrongly, is because they are young and unwise and prepared to kill and risk terrible danger in a way that wise people wouldn't. And will that still occur? And will that is true. That is true. And you don't. The truth is not popular, but it is the case. Why do we send young men out to kill, except because of that? And secondly, you might be aware of the fact that there are strong moves now to lower the voting age to 16. How many of you want to have your futures decided by 16-year-olds?
Well, I have to say that as a former Secretary of State for Defence, to describe the British Armed Forces in the language you did is disgraceful.
Well, you always were a very effective demagogue, Heseltine. But I think I haven't described the British Armed Forces in any sense at all. I've simply told the truth.
You described the soldiers in language which was viciously unfair to them.
Young men are unwise. You were unwise when you were young, and so was I. And don't try to deny it or silence me with silly rhetoric of the kind that you're using.
You certainly were unwise because you used to work for the Socialist Worker Party.
I've said nothing uncomplimentary about the armed forces, and you know it perfectly well.
You wait till you see the transcript.
How dare you suggest that I have?
You wait till you see the transcript.
Jury trials.
But just to clarify, perhaps you'd say what you said about 18-year-olds once more.
That they are that we cynical politicians send young men out to kill and be killed. That's what I said.
No, it's not what you said.
It is what I said.
You said they were stupid.
I said no such thing.
Well, we'll see
check the recording.
We'll see the record.
Well, we can't check. Yes, you said. And then we must go on.
I'm 18. I'm joining the armed forces next year. I think I can make an educated decision, much more than some people who are older than me, perhaps. I might not be mature than other people, but I'm still mature enough to decide on what I want to do, and also to be on a jury if I wanted to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Let's go on, because we're quarter of the way through the programme. Remember, at home, as you know, you can join in the debate on text or on Twitter. Our hashtag is BBCQT. Laurie Penny of The New Statesman is our Twitter panellist tonight, and you can follow her at BBC Extra Guest. You can text comments to 83981, and the red button will tell you what others are saying. And the next question is from Tom Krill, please. Tom Krill.
Heather Frost, an unemployed mother of 11, is being built a 6-bedroom eco-mansion by her local council. Is this an example of society looking after those in need, or is it a waste of taxpayers' money?
Vince Cable.
Well, we don't know a great deal about this particular family, other than what her neighbours, who clearly didn't approve of her, told one of the popular newspapers. This was, as I understand it, was certainly not a mansion, and it was being occupied at the rate of 2.5 people a room.
So she wouldn't get taxed on it by the Liberal Democrats?
No, she wouldn't. She was accused of having a horse, but, I mean, actually, she had quite a large family, and as I understand it, the older children were working and earning and paid for it. But the really serious issue was that the popular press went for this lady because she had a large number of children. She had 11 children. You know, the argument was, isn't this woman feckless? You know, should she not have done something about it? Well, actually, it turned out, when people investigated, that she was actually sterile, but for natural reasons. She's had cervical cancer. She's probably dying. And nobody had the sensitivity to realise that that was her problem. This jumped on this bandwagon, a woman with a horse, a big house, you know, let's condemn her, let's trash her. It's a good way of attacking the benefit system. It's absolutely outrageous the way it was dealt with.
OK. So, Ian Duncan Smith, in your government, has floated the idea of capping child benefits to 2 children, hasn't he? To try and saying after 2 children, it's up to you.
Well, that's a foolish suggestion. I've said so many times publicly that is not the way to deal with child benefit.
And you don't think it'll happen?
No, of course it won't happen.
Ooh. No, it won't happen in the coalition?
Well, what they do on the Conservative government, if we ever have one, is up to them. But this is not coalition policy.
Michael Heseltine.
Well, you've just heard it's not the coalition policy. It is not the component policy of the Conservative Party. And so why should I try to defend what is not in existence?
It's just Ian Duncan Smith floating a few thoughts.
Well, I don't know what that amounts to. And does it mean that someone said... does it mean that someone said he'd said it? Did some advisor say we're going to ask him to do it? Has he made a speech saying this?
He said it to the Today programme, which is the Bible, as you know, of modern politics. Well, he said he suggested a cap on child-related benefits at 2 children. My view is, if you did this, you'd start it for those who begin to have more than, say, 2 children. Yeah, well,
the fact is that he has been a pioneer in looking at the whole back-to-work agenda, and he's floating an idea which is his.
Let's get back to Heather Frost.
It's not Conservative Party policy.
Let's get back to Heather Frost and the 11 children and the eco-mansion that's being built. What's your view of that?
I think probably that I start off where virtually everybody would start off and saying, why are we providing facilities of this sort, at this expense, for somebody who has got 11 children? Because that is way out of what normal expectation is. That's where one, in the gut, starts. Now you put yourself in the position of the local authority. The fact is, what are they going to do? Are they going to put her on the street? They've got to have a solution. If there are 11 children, it takes a lot of accommodation. And I would never, and if I was in the local authority, I would never put her on the street. And from that moment on, you have a problem. But fortunately, it is so much of an exceptional problem that I don't think we ought to try and turn it into public policy.
OK. The man up there on the right.
Well, the simple reason why we're providing this house is the Conservative-originated policy of selling all the council houses.
OK. Peter Hitchens.
Well, that point is absolutely right. The much-lauded policy of selling council houses has actually been a catastrophe for this country, and it has deprived us of a very, very important resource for a cheap electoral gain. And the way in which this decision is now universally praised always puzzles me. I think now that housing benefit now costs more than the Royal Air Force, and is a much more inefficient, unfair and wasteful way of housing people than the council houses used to be. The issue about the lady herself, I'm all in favour of big families. I think they're great, but I think that they should be founded upon marriage, and they should be founded upon people supporting themselves, if at all possible. But if you set up a system where welfare payments are paid and houses given to people who are not in that circumstance, you can't be surprised when they take advantage of that system. I don't blame this lady for what she's done at all. I blame the politicians who for 50 years have encouraged this kind of behaviour. You can't say that it's the responsibility of the people who look at the system and take advantage of it. That is absurd. If we want it to stop, then we need to turn to our politicians and say, reform the welfare system, which you have made absurdly overgenerous, and also do something about restoring the institution of marriage, which you have systematically destroyed.
Giles Fraser.
I think it's scandalous that we are using the example of this woman as sort of propaganda for benefit cuts. I think we're actually being softened up by examples like this, that there's some sort of distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor. And it really, for me, is a sort of cover for a much greater scandal, which is the scandal in our housing market, the scandal of what's happening to poor people, particularly in London, where house prices are soaring completely out of control, and ordinary people can't live here. And, you know, what's happening at the moment in London is that ordinary people are being priced out of the centre of town, and we're going to end up being like Paris in this country soon, where, you know, all of the poor people live on the outside and all of the wealthy people live on the middle. And these are the real scandals. And you find one small example of a woman like this, which sort of tugs at this seems unfair, but actually it's propaganda for a much, much nastier form of cuts, and that's the real scandal here.
After doing just a little bit of research, I found out a little bit more about this case, and it turns out that it wasn't actually a local authority that built the house for her. The local authority sold the land to a housing association. The housing association then built the land and built the house, which then rents it out to this woman and her family. She doesn't own the house, she's simply paying rent on it. And being a caseworker, I know that once she leaves, if she does leave that, another large family will then take that place and then also pay rent to the housing association who owns the land. Isn't this another example of one of those stories to demonize people who are on benefits, because they've now become public enemy #1, because they're frankly an easy target. As a caseworker, I used to deal with a lot of people who are on benefits. People would always come up to me and say, I've worked hard all my life, now I'm on benefits and I'm ashamed of myself. This demonizing has now made people who have paid all their years of national insurance feel ashamed of the money that they have taken, they have a right to take. Why are we doing this to the people who most need our help? We know the economy is bad. There are more people on benefits. We should be helping these people, not hindering them.
Okay. And the man in the back there. The man in the back row there, yes.
The reason the UK has such large volumes of debt is because of these high welfare payouts. We can't afford to build people houses willy-nilly.
And what do you think of this case?
It's just an example of how generous these welfare benefits are that we can't afford.
Okay. And the man over there on the left.
I take issue with the canon that anybody has an entitlement to live in central London. I've worked all my life. I live not in Middlesex, in Hertfordshire. I can't afford to live in central London. Why should people have it as an entitlement?
You want to answer that as I come to
Yes. The question is, what sort of city do we want? Do we want a city full of capital city full of very, very, very expensive houses owned by Russian oligarchs where no one lives? It becomes a ghost town and all the poorer people live on the outside. I think we want a London that we've always had, which is a mix of people. And I understand I couldn't afford to live in London in a million years, so I understand that. But actually the idea that ordinary people can't afford to live in London, I think, has actually become a scandal.
We'll come to a question that's pertinent to that amendment, but Diane Abbott on this point.
Anybody who thinks that overall the welfare system is absurdly overgenerous doesn't know many people trying to live on welfare benefits. Not a week goes by without one of these scare stories. Picking out someone who on the face of it doesn't seem like a member of the deserving poor is splashed in our tabloid papers. And as you've heard, it's to soften us up for benefit cuts, not just for women that don't work with 11 children, but for people that do work, that are struggling, that are dependent on tax credits and so on. And when you drill down with these stories, it's never what it seems. She's not been given a house. As the gentleman pointed out just now, the council sold a piece of land for £220,000 to a housing association who've built a 6-bedroom unit on it, which she's going to be allocated. When her children leave home, she'll have to move out. But the real point is this. It has been a principle of British welfare legislation since the 1945 National Assistance Act that we don't put children on the street. And the gentleman that said, oh, it's a waste of public money, what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting the children go into care? That would cost hundreds of thousands a week. You cannot take these bad, difficult cases and use them to undermine our system of welfare. Of course, there's an underlying narrative, oh, that London, Hackney, the East End is full of people on benefits who don't want to work. Let me tell you, I see more people on benefits every week than anyone on this panel because it's the nature of my constituency. I don't see people who don't want to work. I see people that want to work, children that have left school, kids that have left university, people that have been made redundant from all these shop jobs we're losing, who want to work and cannot get jobs. I'm glad unemployment is getting down, but the issue is not this one woman with her rather baroque case. The issue is how we're softened up for increasing benefits cuts, whereby the poor pay for a financial crisis which bankers made.
The fact that every penny collected in income tax goes on welfare, surely that's a sign that the welfare's too big?
Half of that money goes to pensioners. What are you suggesting? That we should stop paying old age pensions?
Not at all.
No, I don't think he's suggesting that at all. He's suggesting something entirely different.
The amount of income tax collected in this country now doesn't even cover the Navy, the Army. Most money that's collected in income tax goes on welfare and pensions. You know, it's a huge amount. It's a huge amount.
Well, are you really suggesting that we should spend more on helicopter gunships and less on the most vulnerable in our society?
No, not at all. Not at all, but there must be a line that is getting too big.
You're suggesting that, sorry, to get it right, you're suggesting the proportion of money spent on welfare is greater than it should be from the tax take.
Yeah,
is that
certainly.
your point?
If every penny collected in income tax goes on welfare, then all the other things that have to be paid for have to come from other taxes.
Vince Cable, he's the man in the know on this.
Well, let's start from the same point. I actually agree with Diane. This was a banking-induced crisis. We're paying the price for it. And the economy's smaller and we're all poorer. And there is a genuine problem about the welfare budget. That doesn't mean to say you should demonise people who are beneficiaries of it, but there is a problem that the budget is rising rapidly at a time when the economy isn't, and we have to deal with it. And there is a particular problem around housing benefit. And Giles explained the reason, that in London, I think something of the order of 85,000 council houses have been lost. They were sold. There are more people needing them, so they're pushed into the private sector, private rents. Rents go through the roof. You, the taxpayer, then have to subsidise the landlords to keep those people in place. The budget gets out of control, and that's why we've had to introduce some very painful and difficult measures to deal with it. So it is possible, I think, and it is right, to be compassionate to people who are genuinely poor and need help, while recognising that there's a real problem with the welfare budget, and we have to deal with it.
It's very interesting that the whole financial explosion really began in America with Fannie Mae and Fannie Mae, when President Clinton encouraged them to be more generous to help low-income families to get housing. That's where it began. It then became a sort of phenomenon across the Western world. And, of course, you can single out the bankers, and nobody is likely to defend them because they are in the spotlight and all that.
We are in the City of London. There might be some defenders around here.
Yeah, but you know what I mean. By and large, they're the easy target. Governments spent incomparably more money than their economies could afford. Individuals borrowed on their credit cards, on their mortgages, on whatever it may be. They're all hocked up to the eyeballs. And the bankers are in the middle of it all. And so we were all in the same game, politically, economically, banking, companies, the whole lot.
No.
And the bubble burst. And when the bubble burst, everybody drew in their horns. And it is so easy to find someone to blame. No. We were all involved in this, particularly the last Labour government.
No,
you get carried away.
It's a well-worn track. We don't want to go down it again tonight, because we've been down it several times. But I want to move on to another question, because we're halfway through our programme. And it's from Kate Horton, please.
The latest census suggests that white Brits are now in a minority in London, accounting for just 45% of residents. Is this a good or a bad long-term trend?
The latest census suggests white British-born are now in a minority in London, 45% of residents. Is it good or a bad trend? Michael Heseltine.
If there's one speech I made of which I am proud, it was in October 1981. in which I included the words, they're black, they're British, they were born here, they vote here. That is a fact. So there's nothing you can do to turn back history. I defied my party in the late 60s over the Race Relations Bill, when I believed that anyone who lived in this country was entitled to live here within the law, without prejudice, and with equal opportunity. And that now is the position. So is it strong? Is it weak? Is it right? Is it wrong? It is a fact, and we should live with it, and we should build on it, and we should see the incredible talent that there is in the immigrant community, and always has been, whether they were Huguenots or whether they were Jews or Catholics, whatever. Well, that's a different issue, but it's still the same issue, that we have had many diverse groups of people, and the only way we will all prosper is to treat them well, live with them, and give them the opportunity to contribute to the wider benefit of society, which they want to do because actually they have exactly the same instincts that we do. They want to be happy, they want to love their children, they want to live in peace, they want to live in the law, and the vast majority of them want to work hard.
Kate, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean,
But I just wanted to know everyone's views on that.
All right. What do you think, Peter Hitchens, about the balance that she's described?
Well, my gorge rises at the use of the word white. The issue should never be, and really should never be, the colour of somebody's skin. I thought we all very, very long ago accepted that what mattered about somebody was not the colour of his skin, but the content of his character. And I'm not interested in what colour they are.
So why does the census
What I'm
collect
interested,
this
well,
data?
I don't know. I think what we're really talking about here is something else. Because the real question is, does a country which has a very large amount of immigration adapt to the immigrants, or do the immigrants who arrive in that country adapt to that country? And it's my very strong view that the only hope of a tranquil and peaceful and productive and successful society is that the migrants adapt to the place to which they come. And for very many years, we have not been encouraging or indeed helping them to do that. We've been encouraging through a policy of official state multiculturalism that people should stay separate and should remain within their migrant communities, and we have not created a single British nationality. There are various feeble efforts to make them take exams in how to claim social security benefits or who was Winston Churchill. That is not the same. We have ceased to be proud of our own country, culture, history, religion, language, and we haven't asked our new citizens to be proud of them either. And we now see the result of that. It's not a question of whether they're white, it's a question of whether they're British. And my fear is they're not becoming British, and that Britain is ceasing to be Britain. And that is a very great shame, both for us who were already here and for those who have come.
You, sir, in the second row.
I had the privilege to be a games maker during the Olympic Games last year, London 2012. We would not have got those games had we not been a diverse and international city. I had the privilege of meeting citizens of 20, 30, 40 different countries during my time as a games maker. And I said to them, what do you think of the Olympics? What do you think of London? And the common response that I got, wherever in the world they came from, is London is my second favourite city. London is their second favourite city because of its diversity, because of its international perspective, because of its history.
Okay. And the person up there on the... Yes.
I was just following on from that gentleman's point that I don't think that immigrants come here to become British. They come here because it's the closest they can find to a democracy where they can live the lives that they want to live, to follow the faiths that they want to follow. And I think that should be celebrated, and that's what makes Britain British.
Giles Fraser, can I just...
Mistaken.
Giles, can I just repeat the question, which was the latest census says that white British are now in a minority in London, 45% of residents. Is that good or bad as a trend?
I'm indifferent to it. I mean, I think it makes no difference, white, black, whatever. I think that's... I'm not interested, and I don't think that the census ought to collect that information at all. I mean, the underlying point is that I think London is the most wonderfully diverse place in the world. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else precisely because of that diversity. And it always has had a history of welcoming people from all around the world. My surname was originally Friedeberg, not Fraser, and that was because, you know, a lot of my family on my father's side came over here as Jewish immigrants and contributed greatly to this society as waves of people from all around the world have done so. It enriches our culture. And the idea that it's some sort of problem, that multiculturalism is a problem. I'm an unashamed multiculturalist. I think it adds hugely to what is so rich and exciting about a place like this.
But so you disagree with Peter Hitchens?
I completely disagree with Peter Hitchens.
Completely. OK. The woman up there in the back row. Yes.
My grandparents came to this country in the early 20th century as immigrants from Eastern Europe. And they brought up my parents, who in then turn brought up me, to respect everything British. This country fed us, clothed us, educated us. I don't, excuse me, I don't think it's a problem with colour. I think any problem that we have is in my grandparents' house and my parents' house, English was spoken. Everybody was expected to learn our host language, to learn our host manners, to respect the law, etc., and everything that goes with it. So when people are talking about colour, I don't actually think they are meaning colour. I think they're meaning culture. And that's where I think that we have to integrate to get a fully integrated community.
Diane Abbott?
Well, I'm one of those 55% non-white people living in London. And let me say this. London is the city that immigration made. It's not a question of London tolerating immigrants. Immigrants made London, whether it was Irish labourers in the 19th century, whether it was West Indian nurses after the war, whether it's Asian shopkeepers, whether it's French and American bankers here in the City of London. London, all the great world cities, London and New York and Paris, they are cities that have been built by immigrants that attract people from all over the world. And as for the talk of how we non-white Britons have to adapt to British culture, there is no group of people more passionately pro-British, more passionately pro-royalty, actually, than the working-class West Indians amongst whom I grew up. It is a very crude assumption to assume that because you were born overseas, you don't love this country and don't love the royal family. And just my final point, because there's a lot of talk about there's fewer white people are moving out. The demographic patterns in London are to do with class, not colour. My parents came to this country, lived in Paddington, Notting Hill borders. They moved out to Harrow, then they moved out to Edgware. Now my brother lives in Buckinghamshire. That's not white flight. That is people gradually moving up the social ladder. Class is the issue, not race. I'm proud to be a Londoner. I'm proud London is one of the most diverse cities on the planet, and it's its diversity which makes it a great city.
Okay.
Well, I agree with everything Diane's just said. I mean, as it happens, have a racially mixed family of my own. I don't know whether my 3 children and grandchildren are regarded as white or non-white on your definition. I mean, I think the
census.
Yes, well, it's offensive to try to draw conclusions based on it, and it takes us back to the kind of South African apartheid era.
Do you think the census should abandon the idea of
I think
colour?
It should, actually. I was opposed to it in the first instance. I don't think it adds anything, and it creates unnecessary division. But going back to the original question, is this good or bad? I mean, what is bad is if you get segregation and ghettos. I mean, some American cities have got that form. I don't think this is actually happening in London. I think London is a much more mobile, vibrant city, and our ethnic minorities do actually spread out. I represent a constituency in southwest London, Twickenham. When I first went to live there, it was almost exclusively white. Now there's a ethnic minority population of, 10, 12%. It's a much more mixed community. This is happening throughout the UK, and that's desirable and right. Where the public debate, I think, is about, it's not about race, and it shouldn't be about race, whatever that means. There is an argument about migration, and in fact, much of the migration in London has been from Eastern Europe. It's from Poland, Lithuania, and of course they make a positive contribution to the economy. But the migration issue is quite separate from the white, non-white thing, which I really think we should bury.
OK.
David, can I just...
Yes, Michael. Just a second. Yes, to you, and then I'll come to you, Michael. Yes.
There's an article on the BBC webpage about this, BBC News webpage, highlighting that I think it was a white population the size of Glasgow has left London. So it is white flight, which kind of highlights that this integration isn't happening.
It's a class issue. It is not the case that white Londoners look at an area and think, oh, there's lots of black people there, I'm not moving there. Middle-class people are moving into Hackney, into Brixton, even moving into Brent, which was a very West Indian area when I was a child. There's an issue about class. The issue about colour is, I think, a misnomer.
Michael Heseltine.
Well, I think the fascinating thing to me is that London is, we all know, enormously diverse today, and Boris Johnson has just become an elected mayor, and that says something about the spread of interests that exist. But the second...
I don't follow that one.
Well, it is, because if it was a sort of class phenomenon and the poor and all that and the blacks...
They wouldn't have voted for Boris.
They wouldn't have voted for Boris. So what Boris has achieved is very interesting, but the point I wanted to make is a different one, about the census. It so happens that in a job I'm doing for the government at the moment, we're looking at the ethnic mix of Birmingham. And you can get statistics which show that the unemployment levels in Birmingham are bad compared with other parts of the country. But if you then look at the ethnic mix of certain communities, you find that they are very significantly Pakistani or Bangladeshi. And the women in those communities, for cultural reasons, don't want to work on the same proportionate levels as other groups of people. So by knowing the racial mix, you realise that it's not that the economy isn't working in those areas, it is simply that the culture within those families persuades the women not to try and work. So it can be helpful in knowing what the problems are.
OK. Do you agree with that? You, sir.
Well, before everyone jumps on the bandwagon that Britain is losing its Britishness, I'd like to ask people like Peter Hitchens, define being British.
So what's the question?
Define being
British.
He wants you to define being British before you assert that Britain is losing its Britishness.
Oh, well, I don't think David would allow me to go on long enough.
David won't allow you to go on very long, I can tell you.
No, I'm not. I can't. One of the things about it is it couldn't be defined in a rapid answer. I've written a rather good book about it, though.
All right, and nor will he allow you to promote your book.
You are welcome to read.
All right, you have to talk to him afterwards, get the book, and we'll do it that way. Now, I think we'll move on to another question, because we've had a certain amount of time on that. I want a question from Peter Beaumont, please. Peter Beaumont.
Are the numbers in George Osborne's economic strategy as wildly optimistic as his forecast for the 4G auction?
Yes, remembering that they were hoping to raise 3.5 billion and only got 2 and a bit from the auction of 4G announced today, and it was a key component of the Osborne economic strategy in the autumn statement that this money would come through, so they seem to have a large hole there. Giles Fraser, do you think that the optimism that George Osborne shows is exemplified by the 4G auction?
Well, it's clear that the whole the numbers don't add up, and that this
which numbers don't add up?
The numbers don't add up in the last budget, which was premised on the fact that there was going to be more money coming in from the sale of 4G. But I mean, actually, it's a wider problem. It's the problem about the way in which that budget really doesn't work, because it's premised on the idea that austerity is the only way forward. And I think it just is another example of how the numbers don't work out for the current government, and what we really need to do is we need to invest money in our infrastructure, particularly in our housing, to stimulate the economy, to create more growth, and so that actually we can find a way of getting this economy kick-started again. But at the moment, if all we're doing is sort of garrotting our economy with austerity, we're never going to find a way forward.
OK. It does look, doesn't it, as though far from reducing the national debt, it's going to blossom, or if that's not the right word, balloon under the coalition to something like at the present trend, 600 billion more in the coalition's time in office? If you last...
Well, if you're just talking about borrowing numbers, well, but isn't that sensible? What we're trying to do is to reduce, sorry to be use economic jargon, but the structural deficit. In other words, it's the amount of revenue that we used to get from the banking system and the property bubble that disappeared. And the government's got to try and deal with that in a measured way over time. We've been very pragmatic about it. We started hoping to do this over 4 years. We're now planning to do it over 7, which is the kind of time period that the last Labour government set as it happens. But, I mean, when the economy slows down, the sensible thing to do, the sensible Keynesian thing to do is to let the deficit widen temporarily, and that's what's happened. And similarly, the government's got to borrow to do the kind of thing Giles is talking about, which is to invest in housing and infrastructure, and those are the things that's happening. So the fact that the borrowing
Keynesian in
that respect, yes.
Is he deliberately allowing the debt
yes,
to
we have
grow?
been deliberately flexible on that matter. What the government's trying to do is two things. And this is why the austerity versus growth argument is so foolish. We've got to do two things at once. The first is to try to get the public finances in order, and we're doing that, and it's painful and difficult. But at the same time, you've got to try and stimulate growth, and that does involve doing some of the things that Giles has described, and absolutely right, you know, getting on and building houses, and the impact of that on the construction industry, what we're trying to do through guarantees for housing associations, freeing up land, and so on. So we've got to have attempts to get growth alongside dealing with the deficit. Now, the reason why this is so difficult is because we're dealing with a crisis the likes of which we've not had before. I've often said this is the economic equivalent of a heart attack. Economies don't just bounce back. We're dealing with a banking system that has been very, very badly damaged. We're dealing with government finances that have been hit in an extraordinary way. We're dealing with a pile-up of personal debt, which Michael Heseltine described a few moments ago. Getting out of this crisis is going to be very, very difficult. And it's got to be done by this combination of discipline with the public finances and at the same time trying to support and stimulate economic growth.
But unless I misunderstand you, you're saying that for the moment, Osborne's policy, the coalition policy, is deliberately to allow debt to increase because in Keynesian terms that will expand the economy.
Yes, we've said...
I've never heard it described like that.
Well, I always describe it like that, and we have to be... Okay. We are flexible, and we have to be flexible.
You, sir?
Well, the one thing they're not doing, they should be... There's a good idea to improve the rail service, not build HS2, but improve the rail service is a mess. But what they are not doing is cutting the enormous salaries of town hall workers, civil servants, and their enormous pensions. That's the one thing they're not doing. They're cutting the wrong things and not expanding the right things. Building aircraft carriers with no aircraft. I mean, the things that go on in government are absolutely outrageous.
Michael Heseltine.
Well, the reason why the deficit is continuing is because the government has decided that it will not cut the health service. It will not emasculate the... Well, you may think you want to cut the health service. You get elected on that platform, but this coalition is not going to do it. The welfare system is being preserved very largely intact, very largely intact. So Vince's point is the right one.
There's a telephone game. George Osborne.
Who's that? It's your wife. Is that your wife?
It's the Chancellor ringing in.
It's the 4G auction.
You've gone off message.
No. My wife is supporting what I've been saying, and she just wants to let me know. I'm not going to be stopped. The fact of the matter is that the reason why the economy and George Osborne's budget, therefore, is taking longer to sort is because we're in the middle, as Vince has said, of a world recession that none of us have seen before. It's taking longer to sort out. There is no domestic policy that is going to make a serious difference to the world situation in which we trade. If we can't see recovery in Europe, if China is still slowing, if India is slowing, if America's got a cliff edge situation, that limits our discretion. And it is simply dishonest for any party to come and pretend there's a serious option. We have to sweat it out. But the fact is that the extraordinary thing to me in this relatively stagnant situation is we have got more people at work in this country today than we have ever had. We have more women at work. We have more young people at work. And so, despite the appalling economic world circumstances, this coalition has managed to preserve employment at record levels. And that is extraordinarily impressive.
All right. Diane Abbott. Sweat it out is the only thing to
Yes, Lord Heseltine says we have to sweat it out. The problem is, it is the poorest and middle-income people that are suffering because of this government's economic policies. Dr. Cable is a reasonable man propping up an unreasonable Tory-led government. And of course George Osborne's figures are dodgy. You might argue a lot about George Osborne is dodgy. But I mean, to be perfectly serious, they came in, this coalition, promising to cut the deficit in 4 years.
Well, to clear up your mess, that's what we came in to do.
No, you seem to have forgotten.
Yeah.
You seem to be overlooking, Lord Heseltine.
What, your mess? You can't overlook your mess. It's staring us in the face.
The collapse of Lehman and what was a world international crisis. But my point is this. It is not the reason that George Osborne's figures are dodgy is completely predictable. You do not achieve growth by making the sorts of cuts in public expenditure that this government has done. And for Lord Heseltine to say, oh, the reason we can't clear up the deficit is because we didn't cut the NHS, tell that to the people in North West London and Lewisham that are seeing their accident and emergency shut and their hospital closed. I mean, that's just completely delusional to say they're not cutting the NHS.
Just to clarify, are you saying, therefore, that the debt should be allowed to rise even further than it's rising at the moment?
No,
yes, you
David,
are.
no,
yes, you are.
We have always said there have to be cuts, but we've said that cuts of this scale. The problem is, as you probably know, that when you cut in the public sector like this, it has a multiplier effect in the private sector. There are tradesmen, there are builders, there are service workers all across London who can't make money because of the cuts in public sector spending. The cuts the Tories have made have plunged us into a double-dip recession, and if we're not very fortunate, it'll be a triple-dip recession. Osborne's figures are off, and the rest of us are paying the price.
All right, I'm going to listen to some members of the audience for a moment, and then I'll come to you, Peter. Yes, you, sir.
The problem actually isn't, and this is what the panel's missing, the problem it doesn't matter if the deficit is growing at the moment. The problem is the Bank of England's credibility about to be tested? We've got rising rates in the back end of the gilt curve, and we've got a falling currency. That is the real problem. Can we manage our debt?
And you think the size of the deficit,
it doesn't matter at the moment. Everybody's got a large deficit. It's can we manage it? Will the Bank of England, will it become a problem for them?
And the woman behind you, in the one row behind, yes.
I was going to say that there are some areas of our economy that are still growing, like the creative and cultural industries, which currently are 7% of our GDP. What can we do to help those industries really pull us out of recession?
OK, and we'll come to that point if we can hold it. And the woman up there in the second row from the back, or third row from the back, yes.
I just think corporate tax from private companies seem to be a driving force in raising tax revenue and to help pay the country's deficit. What is the government doing helping businesses and promoting growth?
I'm not clear what you're saying. That you should or shouldn't be relying on corporate tax.
I'm just saying corporate tax is helping raise tax revenue, but the government seems to be helping. The government isn't seem to be helping private businesses to promote growth.
OK, and the man up there in blue, you, sir.
I find it rather rich to hear Diane Abbott say that, you know, the public sector, where there's cuts from government expenditures. The government is not really cutting public sector expenditure. It's still increasing in real terms. And what Labour left as an inheritance was so bad that the country is now having to pay the price for that.
OK. And you, sir, here on the left.
The government is making cuts in the NHS and in public services. It's doing it in my hospital, Lewisham, as Diana mentioned, and it's doing it because neighbouring hospitals had such poor PFIs negotiated by the government. And they're now in huge debt. They can't afford to close them. So they're actually closing a functioning hospital. They're making cuts where they can.
Vince Cable, just briefly on the point of public sector cuts. He right or he right?
Well, there is certainly parts of government, including the bits I'm responsible for, we have had to take some very painful measures and real cuts have had to be made. But as Michael said earlier, the NHS budget is actually protected. I mean, there are pressures on the NHS. They were under the last government. I remember fighting hospital closures when the Ans Party were in power. But nonetheless, the NHS budget has been ring-fenced and protected. But the rest of government is having to take some very serious cuts.
You're looking pained, Giles.
Well,
do you not agree with him?
No, I think there's a moral issue here that we're just slightly evading, and seeing as the fact that we're sitting in the middle of the City of London, and one of the things that the Business Secretary has said before is that, you know, that the city was in part responsible for the financial mess that we're in.
Anyway.
And if it is the case that actually it's people, you know, in this square mile that were largely responsible, and yet the people who are going to pay the price for that are actually the poor and vulnerable on benefits and who need our hospitals and so forth. There is just, independent of the economics, there is a fundamental moral problem with that equation.
Sorry, Peter Hitchens. Peter.
Well, it's interesting to listen to the Conservative and Labour parties, which aren't really that different either in policies or competence, saying we'll have nicer cuts than you.
Who would be better, Peter?
Oh, well, neither of them would, because this isn't a crisis. This is national decline. We have been living for many, many years far beyond our means as a country and as people. And now the debts are being paid. And they will be paid fundamentally, and this is already happening with the currency, and it will happen more when we lose our AAA rating, through a decline in the value of the pound and the consequent inflation. It's happening already through state-sponsored inflation, through quantitative easing. And what will happen in the end is that we will cease to be able to pay, because of this inflation and because of this decline, for the things which we have refused to reform. As a country, we will not look in the face. No political party, and Michael Heseltine's quite right, no political party could stand and say we will cut the National Health Service. They'd lose the election. No political party could stand and say we will cut the welfare state to an affordable level. They'd lose the election. All right, don't let the government do it. Let it happen through inflation and national decline. That is what is happening. That is what you're seeing. This isn't a crisis which will end. This is something which is going to go on and on as we sink to a lower level in the world.
Very briefly, do you agree with that, Michael Heseltine?
Well, there's something in it. And I've always been in favour of reducing public consumption in order to increase public investment. But this morality issue is the one that sticks in my craw. The idea that those of us who are on the right of politics trying to take tough decisions are immoral, whilst those on the left of politics have got a sort of God-given message that makes them apart. Just take this issue of welfare reform. Now, what this government is doing in order to try and contain the welfare budget is saying that there can't be more for a family on welfare than the average earnings of those in work. In other words, the people paying the taxes in work shouldn't expect to sustain living standards for people on the welfare benefit. I can tell you that that will lead to people saying, oh, but what about poor Willie or poor Jemima or whatever it may be, and it's a hard luck story. But that is a moral issue. Why should the vast majority of people at work pay to sustain families who are out of work at higher living standards? That is a moral issue.
And can you comment? We've got to stop, actually, because we've come to the end. Every argument takes us to another argument. We have to stop because our hour is up. We're going to be in Eastleigh next Thursday, the night of the by-election, and we'll go out live after all the voting's over, so we'll be able to talk about why people voted the way they did. I don't know who's going to be on the panel yet, except for the filmmaker Ken Loach. The week after that, we're going to be in Dover, so it's Eastleigh or Dover, your choice. If you want to come to the programme, apply to our website. The address is on the screen there, or call us on 0330 123 9988. My thanks to our panel here.